Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. That is a lovely introduction to the event. And yeah, I'm keen to continue in that spirit. So as some of you may have heard me say at the beginning, this is the pace of this presentation will vary. So there will be a maybe more sedate bit at the beginning, then it will probably get very fast very quickly. I'm primarily here to provide just value in the area of integration. So in the Q&A, I'm happy to really go into any topics around integration just based on my knowledge. Although my presentation will be quite specific, yeah, I basically want to share knowledge and provide value as much as possible. That is the idea. So let me get started. I'm going to share my screen. Get rid of my voting. I'm going to start with a few slides. There won't be many slides in this presentation. So this is end-to-end web integration with bzBond. My name's Alec Gregory. I'm a senior engineering manager at Beezwax. I haven't always been, so I've been a FileMaker developer primarily and full-time since 2008. I started off in-house, then I became a consultant in the UK. So I started in the UK. I then moved to the US to work on a vertical market product in New York. After that was about 4 years. Then I moved into the nonprofit sector in San Francisco. Again, that was in-house. I did a bit of IT management, project management in that role too. And then in 2019, I became a consultant again with Beezwax when I was still in the Bay Area. And I remain there to this day. As I say, I started off as a developer. When I was doing development kind of full time, I was interested, and I still am, in integrations in general, not just web, also QuickBooks, XML, even a bit of Keynote with AppleScript. Always been interested in web technology since before FileMaker, really since the late 90s, probably my first technology production. So the core tech, HTML, CSS, and later JavaScript. Dev tools, I've got a more recent interest in, so creating just tools for particular projects to do admin and DevOps, and also general dev tools. And more recently, in my management role as an engineering manager, I've started managing interdisciplinary teams, which I feel I'm lucky to do as primarily someone from a FileMaker background, but Beezwax is such that we have FileMaker devs, web devs, designers, and Tableau developers. So I've been in teams with all those disciplines, and I've been lucky enough to manage them, and that's something I really enjoy doing. And yeah, hope to do more of. Okay, so enough about me. The agenda for today is extremely rough. We're surprised if we get to all this, especially in the limited time. This is where we want to go. We've done the icebreaker and data gathering, great. Next, we're going to look at an example, which is going to form the core of the presentation. And it's going to allow us to look at bzBond, what it is and what it does in the realm of web integrations. Probably separately, so after the web integration example, we're going to look specifically at server-side JavaScript, hopefully. If we have time, I'll try and make time for that, because I think it is a core, a kind of novel thing about bzBond that enables server-side JavaScript in a very particular way. If we don't have time for it, we can maybe handle it in the breakout room. We'll then, if we have time, we probably won't. Happy to do more details in anything in the Q&A, more examples, general Q&A, or just, comments. Really, I just want to allow people to discuss and comment on what they've seen. And I'll also just emphasize that this is an open source product at the end. Okay, so that is hopefully where we're going to go roughly. And I did miss one thing off there, which is basically, before I go into too much detail, I want to briefly say, what is bzBond? So bzBond is essentially an open source tool set for web integrations and FileMaker. It's an open source project. Okay, so everything you're seeing is open source. It's documented. Here's the documentation. As you may have guessed from seeing this, it's on GitHub. So you can find it on GitHub. The URL is beezwax/bzBond. We can put that in the chat for the actual clickable link, but it's here. You can look at it now if you want. You can look at it after the presentation. So the things I'm mentioning, some I'll go through extremely fast, but just rest assured that it is all in the documentation. Documentation is extensive and it will be made more extensive as we go. So yeah, don't feel you have to get everything the first time. And a brief about the kind of history and genesis of this project. It's been around in some form, like internally, for at least 2 years. It's been open source in this form for maybe 3 or 4 months. But the thing I want to get across is that it's been providing value to clients internally in Beezwax, and obviously the clients we work with, for almost as long as it's been around. So around 2 years we've been testing this and refining it. So it's fairly mature. It's also maintained not just by an individual, but by a small team of Beezwax. And it's a joint effort of the web team, the design team, and the FileMaker team. Okay, that's enough about that. So this is what we're going to be discussing today in the context of web integration. So we are going to move on to a web integration demo or an example. So whilst you were putting in your icebreakers, I was desperately typing them in to the system for an imaginary organization. And the imaginary organization is called the People Foundation. They maintain a database of historical and notable figures, as well as topics and events they are linked to. And again, this is imaginary, but I feel has some realism in it. So this foundation would like to basically do more with the data they have. So they want to get visitors, interns, staff members more interested in the people and events that they have in their system. So classic thing, they basically want to put their data to work in an innovative way. So their development team decides to make an educational game, and that game is called People Talk. Again, pretty uninspired, you might say. Based on entirely the data that was typed into the system, so, you know, rubbish in, rubbish out. Luckily, I think you did pretty well. So hopefully it's going to be an okay result. So one Monday morning after developing this game, the staff log into their system and this is what they see. Not usually. So this is their FileMaker system and oh look, they've got something to try out. Okay, quick pause. This is a live demo. I've had a kind of 99.9% success rate in my tests. So let's hope this works. All right, it's a game. It looks like I need to click these things. I'm really bad at it. In fact, I've missed every single one. Okay, I need to try again. I need to catch at least 2 people. All right, let me try again. Maybe without talking, it'll be easier. Oh, there's 1, there's 2, 3. I'm not going to try because I don't want too many people. Okay, all right, now I've got a bit further in the game. I caught Miles Davis, James Cameron, and Bono. Okay, looks like I can select a topic for them to discuss. What would be a good one? So it's a music-based, you know, it's skewed towards music, so we probably want to ditch the movie stuff, although that might be interesting. I feel like I want to embarrass Bono, so let's see. Let's put this on Miles Davis's turf and see what happens. Okay, so looks like I can hear a story about playing jazz trumpet, or at least discussing that between those people. Okay, so this is one of the more sedate sections of the talk. If you can, just digest the text there. Remember, this is kind of educational, maybe for younger people, or people just to relax and have a break from work. So fairly light-hearted, but has a kind of educational bent. It's trying to encourage inquiry.
Miles Davis, James Cameron, and Bono walked into a dimly lit jazz bar in New York City. They were all here for one reason: to discuss playing jazz trumpet with one another. Miles Davis greeted the other two with his signature detached demeanor. James Cameron was surprised to see Davis, as he had always thought of him as more of a legend and less of a real person. Bono, meanwhile, was thrilled to be in the same room as two of his musical idols. They took a seat at a small, round table in the back of the bar. Davis already had a whiskey in front of him, and Cameron and Bono ordered drinks of their own. "So, what brings us together today?" Cameron asked. Davis took a long sip of whiskey before answering, "I've been wanting to collaborate with some new musicians lately, and I thought the two of you might be interested." "Well, I'm certainly game," Bono said eagerly. "I'm not much of a jazz musician," Cameron confessed, "but I do have an ear for music." Davis shrugged. "That's all you need, really, to listen and respond." The conversation turned to the specifics of playing trumpet in a jazz band. Davis talked about his improvisational style, and Bono and Cameron questioned him about the technicalities of playing certain notes. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to more personal topics. Davis talked about his struggles with addiction, and Bono shared stories from his early days as a musician in Ireland. Cameron found himself caught up in the magic of the moment. He had always been a filmmaker first and foremost, but there was something about the intimate atmosphere of the jazz club that made him want to explore new creative avenues. Before they left, Davis pulled out his own trumpet and played a mournful melody for his new friends. Bono and Cameron listened in rapt attention, and for a moment they all felt swept up in the beauty of the music. As they walked out of the club, Cameron looked up at the night sky and felt a new surge of inspiration. Who knew what exciting creative ventures awaited him now that he had three new friends in his corner?
All right. So first, please tell me you heard that, people who had sound on.
Yes, I heard that.
Yeah, I did.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. I forgot to check I was sharing audio, but I was. Okay. So we saw the text before. That was the story. Just kind of for reference, there is the text of the story. It's there. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. Certainly standard that we got. So, what that would do in an app sense is we'd want, if it was students, we could ask them to write an assignment on that, about what they heard. Well, maybe not write an assignment, but talk about it. And maybe it would be a bit of light relief for a worker at the foundation. So that is essentially a FileMaker web integration. All of this is in FileMaker, so this is a FileMaker window, and there are web elements in the front end and the back end. So just to briefly go over what we saw. So we saw initially a fast-paced sort of classic browser-style game where we're trying to catch notable people to have a discussion. The player then selected a topic from a list of options, and then a story based on that topic with those people was written and read out. During the process of that being created, the player was encouraged to question the realism of the story and its very foundations, as who was writing it, who was reading it. So we will be answering those last two questions as we look at the app as a whole, as well as other questions too. So I know we said no questions till the end. Anyone have any kind of burning questions right now, or just kind of isn't getting where we're going? Because I'm about to dive into the details. So if you have anything really outstanding, please speak now. All righty, let's go. Okay, so as I said, this is a FileMaker web integration. So it's split into three parts. There's the UI component, so that's the game interface we've seen here. And that is a web interface. There's a data integration that would have been pretty obvious. The topics and the names that we saw came from FileMaker data that I entered in the intro. And then on the back end, something you may not have seen is the microservice integration. So generating, reading, and preparing the story, that was done via microservices. So those were a different kind of integration to the front end. So the kind of thing they have in common is that bzBond underpins all of them. So let's take a look, see how it does that. Do remember, because this is where we get into detail, the kind of the API documentation and the general documentation is available in the repo. So this will not be a complete how-to or a complete investigation of all the features. It'll just touch on the integration points and hopefully, inspire, raise questions, and make people interested to do integrations in general and maybe look into bzBond in particular. Okay, so I'm going to start with the UI. The UI component of the integration, so what we see here, this entire window, everything that came before it. And by the way, we can go again if we want. We can do the whole thing again. I'm not going to do the whole thing again, but I can, we can play the game again. And I won't do another story, but it's kind of, you can get, play as much as you like. So that entire UI and the following UI, if we did the story, that is essentially what's becoming known as a standard web app. And that is to say, it combines HTML and CSS with JavaScript modules. And that's how a lot of people write web applications that go into production these days. And that's what this is. So that's the key thing to note, is that bzBond is designed to support what I'm calling standard web apps, what other people might call single page apps, or modern web apps, or NPM packages, or NPM apps is also what you'll hear them called. But they're basically how a lot of custom web development is done these days. Okay, so the element we're going to look at regarding that integration with the kind of standard web apps is bzBond.js. So here is our web integration itself, the code for it. We're going to just look at the touch points where bzBond.js gets involved. This is a simple structured web app. It's got a single JavaScript file. If you are not familiar with seeing this sort of thing, don't worry, it's a brief segment. So this is the key kind of, how do we get the technology in bzBond into our app? It's here via an import statement. That is standard and common. And the initial install is via npm install, which is also very common. Once we've got it, how do we use it? Well, there are various functions of bzBond. The ones we use here is there's sync config is the first one I wanted to highlight. So we're setting a variable to the result, something called sync config. There's another one here, which is perform script. You see we are seemingly using that config object we got to perform a script, and the name of that script is based on something in the config. This is just a parameter. There's one other place where we touch, where we run a bzBond function, and that's another perform script function. And that's, again, the script name itself is based on something in config. We'll look at that in more detail in a while. And then we, again, have a parameter going in. What is that doing? It's, the first one was getting the people from the database. It didn't work that out. And this one is getting the story and getting the audio for the story from FileMaker. So those are the three touch points. We get something called config, which we'll look at in a moment. We then set up we get the people required to run the assets in the game. And then when we're generating the story, we get the text of the story and the audio file. So those are the three integration points, we can call them. Okay, so that is fairly minimal at this stage. Let me minimize that. Okay, now let's look on the FileMaker side of the integration. So this is a part of the bzBond library called bzBond Claris. These are all documented in the repo. I'll just very quickly look at it once so you can see that we have bzBond.js, we just covered that. Now we're doing Claris. The rest of it we're not going to directly cover, but we will look at bzBond server. So just as a kind of map for where we're going. Okay, so the FileMaker side, bzBond Claris, this is a bit more involved because FileMaker is at the heart of these integrations, right? That's where it's our base for all the integration activity. So we've seen that the web app calls FileMaker using the bzBond object. What are those calls doing, and what else is needed to integrate the web app successfully? So I'm going to start with the most basic thing that bzBond on the Claris side does, and that is simply store the code in that web app. So this is not necessarily a standard way of doing things, so I did want to highlight it. For bzBond integrations, the code is stored as data, as you can see here. Now, we may have just looked at the web project in a text editor, but our final build of the web project is stored in FileMaker itself, in the solution. And you can see it here. This is the exact code. It doesn't look nice, but don't worry, you never have to decipher the compressed version of the code you see here. But there it is. Okay, the next key thing we do with bzBond Claris is to actually deploy the code into web viewers. So the actual interface you saw was obviously in a web viewer. The code has to get from here to the web viewer. So how is that done? The first thing to note is we have a name of this web project, people-talk. So that is a key element. And the next element is basically what we call a config for the web viewer itself. So this is our layout. And if we get into layout mode, we'll see a web viewer. And this is set up in a specific way. I won't go into the full details, but I want to hit the main points of interest. So in your web viewer calculation dialog, you need to define a few things to integrate. The first thing is you do need the web viewer name that's set in the object inspector. It also has to be set here. And this is mostly boilerplate, like up to here, it's boilerplate. And then you get involved here, basically putting the web viewer name in. Here's probably the most important part of the config. You have to put the web project name in. We've seen our web project in the manager. It's called People Talk, so that's what we're doing here. After that, you can really do what you like in the config. You're just doing what helps you integrate. In our case, we have a couple of scripts. We have one called get people for getting the people. So we're defining the name of it here. And we have a script for creating the story. Again, we're defining the name here. Now, why do we do that? It's basically a technique to prevent the web devs and the FileMaker dev activity getting too kind of tightly coupled together. If you have this layer of separation, the FileMaker dev could change their script name in FileMaker, change the name here in FileMaker, and the web dev wouldn't have to get involved. The same way that if the web dev wants to do some operations on the code, they don't have to worry about hard-coded references, which is sometimes difficult to handle with web dev build tools. So this is, it's not required, but it's a good technique and it's good practice. And you can also put anything else in this config object. What we recommend is that you don't put data, especially large amounts of data in here. It's better to handle that using scripting to grab data. So yeah, but pretty much anything else goes that helps you run the web integration. And the final key thing to note is we are not setting the code here. You see the return is a blank string. All we're doing is making config available to the script that actually loads the web viewer. So again, we're not going to look in detail at it, but there's a script in the integration, in the bzBond integration folder, which is called load web viewer, that is essentially consuming the config we've defined here and then loading the correct project, making the config available for the web viewer. So that is the deployment method. It may seem slightly convoluted if you've used other more direct methods like custom functions or just direct coding. The main reasons we do it is to enable debugging and live development. It's useful to use a scripted way of populating web viewers, and also to increase reliability for these web integrations. The idea of bzBond is to be a library, so we want to get maximum reliability over different platforms, so WebDirect, FMGo, for example, and also just in general, we want stuff to load. So we have little tools in our script that can improve your chance of loading your web viewer successfully. So our focus is try and get close to 100% successful web viewer loading as possible. So that's why we have this scripted layer to give us full control over when things load. And you can leverage that yourself. Okay, probably a bit too long on that. So let's move on. So the last thing we need to cover is just basically the mechanics of how, when we call our, let me go to a less busy layout, how when we call a script in using our bzBond JS in the web viewer, what does it actually do? So essentially all activity between the web viewer and FileMaker is mediated by a script called bzBond relay. It's not a script you need to get to know in detail. It's an interface you should know about, but the implementation detail is not so important. The idea is, in order to make FileMaker behave as an expected kind of web citizen in the API world, if we're talking about a web dev just wanting to call FileMaker as an API, then FileMaker scripts have to be able to return results and basically interact with things called promises in the web world. And the bzBond relay script includes all that management and technology. So it means that when you're on the website, you could be fairly confident that you're going to get a usable result back from a FileMaker script, even if that result is not expected or an error. So we won't go into too much detail in that script, but it's there. Obviously, you can look at it if you like, and it handles the activities. It's a mediating script, and lots of other integration libraries have this kind of concept. It's not unique to bzBond by any means. Okay, so that is the sort of FileMaker side of the front end component. Now, the active part of the people talk game, the bit we saw in the UI, that is covered basically entirely by the two components we've just described. But there's a whole extra part to the game, right? There's the post game where we're consuming rather than generating content. So in the post game, the text of the short story is generated from a prompt. It's then read out by a realistic voice, and finally it's prepared for playing in the web UI. So those tasks are highly specialized. These days, tasks like that are often provided as cloud-based services by software companies. So an efficient way to interact with those services and other software as well is using the concept of microservices. It's not time to go into that concept in detail, but essentially they're small pieces of small applications that provide very specific functionality. And in the case of kind of large and complex cloud-based services, they often can drastically reduce the development time required to deliver what the services offer. So in order to take advantage of microservices, we use bzBond Server. The bzBond Server is a microservice itself, which does, and its kind of core functions are that it runs JavaScript on the server. That's basically its main core function. But its other function, one we're more interested in here, is that it's also a host for microservices. So you can extend it with additional microservices. It has a kind of bootstrapper or a little template, I guess you could call it, which helps you create microservices which can then be installed into bzBond. And in this application, we're using 3 such bootstrap microservices. So let's take a look at what they are and how we use them. So we're going to skip over some fairly simple steps of actually installing bzBond server on your server. Again, full details in the documentation. It's not too difficult. One caveat, Windows support is coming. We're working on it. It shouldn't take too long. We just haven't quite found the time. Instructions are in the README for Linux and Mac OS. And we can cover it later if people are interested. So once we have bzBond server installed, we can then install our additional microservices. We call these microbonds. And the ones that we're using in our app, you've maybe guessed what at least one of them is. So the first one we use is bzMB Chat, which is a chat GPT integration that takes the prompt, generates the story. The next one, which generates the audio, is probably a lesser known one. It's also more generic. We're using Google text-to-speech to generate the story audio. There are definitely other ways you can generate story audio. To be honest, I use Google text-to-speech because they had a very generous free policy and also really good quality voices. I was pretty impressed with the kind of realism of the voice. Certainly compared to what I've heard in the past, but I know Amazon and Microsoft offer the same thing, so they may be as good or better. Then finally, right at the kind of in the very core, there is a microbond called MP3 concat, which basically stitches together different MP3 files into a single MP3 file. And that is special because it actually doesn't use cloud services. It uses a application that is installed on the server itself. The application, if you're interested, is called FFmpeg, which is basically a media management application. And we're just using it to concatenate MP3s. We don't care about its video capabilities or anything like that. But key thing to note there is that microservices don't have to be in the cloud, right? If you have an application that is difficult to integrate with, you can tame it by wrapping it in a microservice. And that's what we do with FFmpeg. It's basically one of the only applications that provides the functionality we need, but the functionality is hard to manage in its raw format. So we create a microservice to make it manageable. Hopefully that kind of extends the thinking around microservices beyond we all listed the integrations we wanted at the beginning. A lot of the time you want to integrate with something that is not that popular and not that cool, but it does what you want to do. That's totally valid and useful to write a microservice for. And Alec, if you do get the chance to...
Can I interrupt you just a second? There's a question about the screen. Like we see the screen that says people talk, but we don't see we didn't know if you had other visuals on a different screen or if it's just...
The visuals are coming.
Oh, got it. Okay, good. We will wait then.
Yes.
Go ahead,
You're right. No, you're right, because I had these ready. So let me bring them up. So yes, here they are, bzMB Chat. Not much to look at, but the key thing to note is they're on GitHub and that's, they're public. So you can look at them and they're installed from their public GitHub repos. So that's a kind of sense of how bzBond server is extended. It's extended essentially by public GitHub repos. You can use an offline GitHub repo as well, but we haven't gone in that direction here. So bzBond Chat is our chat GPT API. bzMB Talk is the Google text-to-speech API. And MP3 concat is the FFmpeg wrapper. So these are very minimal docs because these are sort of one-time microbonds at the moment, but you have enough here to use them. Anyone can use them. So those are that's where they live. And next, I want to show how we use them. Conscious of the time, there's not a ton left, so I think we'll be okay to wrap up around 8. So how do we've written those microbonds, we've installed them on our server. How do we call them from our app? So we can look at the create story script initially, because that's the first call. So probably went too fast for people to take it in, but the create story script is called when you hit that here story button, like we have that bzBond perform script call. So that then runs this script. And the key things you need to look at are the root here. So we need to set a parameter to say, what microbond are we calling? How do we find it? So in the first instance, we're calling bzMB chat, which we saw the name of the microbond. We have a custom body, which is basically what do we need to send to the microbond to get a result? And that's where we can look at our docs. So we need a prompt, and we can have a temperature if we want. Temperature is just like how wacky the result is. Like if you put it up too high, you just get garbage. I put it up a little bit, so you get a little bit of color, a little bit of character to the stories, but they basically stay on topic. But if you want to go like, you know, put a lot of non sequiturs and nonsense, you can go very high. But I just snuck it up to 1.1. 1 is supposed to be neutral. Anyway, once you have set the kind of essentially the root and the custom body, you can just send that again to the bzBond relay script. We're putting it in a different mode called perform JavaScript, but it's fairly, you know, there's the code weight here is low. Okay, you're not doing too much. This is what you send. Because we want it on the server and we're on the client, we're doing PSOS, and then we get back the results in a particular format. The format of the results is in the documentation, so you know what to expect. I'm just doing kind of, you know, this is just how I handle results, nothing special here. And the idea is at the end, you get whatever you need. We needed a story, we get a story. So fairly low, you know, not much code required to interact. It's generally as complex as it needs to be without much boilerplate. I want to look at generate story audio finally, because that is more complex on the FileMaker side, though not on the microservice side. So I did hit a problem with generating the audio. That was that this lovely studio voice that we heard, Google would only allow limited lengths of audio from that voice. And I thought maybe that's okay, but it was so good, I wanted to keep it. So I've had to do what I would call kind of a semi-complex FileMaker script to handle that. So what I said is, okay, I'm not going to try and do it all at once. I'll do it in bits. And you saw it took quite a while to generate that audio. And the bulk of the reason for that is we are calling the Google text-to-speech API a lot of times, maybe 10 or 12 times. And it takes a while. So here you see we're doing the same thing, set the root, set a custom body. Again, the body is simple, the text value, the name of the voice. So the text we want, how we want it to come out. Then the same thing, we call it the generate story audio is done on the server, so we don't need PSOS here. And we get the result the same way, we handle errors, we get the audio. So although the microbond is simple, we've had to, you know, the logic of our app has meant we've had to do a little bit more if we're using the studio voice. And after we've done the audio generation, we then concatenate the MP3s. So I like this because it shows chaining, right? It shows complexity here. But also, we're essentially chaining the output of one microbond and we're putting it into another. So we create a whole array of base64 audio, and then we're passing it to this other microbond. Again, perform script, you set your root, your custom body, and you get what you need out. And then at the end, you end up with audio, which is a single base64 audio file. And then here we have the simple one. And then there's just various boilerplate stuff to get the audio into a container. And you know, that's implementation stuff, not so important. Okay, so I hope that illustrates kind of what microbonds are, how you can use them, how you can combine them. So 2 things will make this easier. One, they will eventually get rid of the limit for these studio voices. So yay, then we can just use this script to do that, and we can get rid of the MP3 concat dependency altogether. And 2, ChatGPT 4 just came out. They haven't given me access to it yet, which is annoying because I thought I could use it for this presentation. But when it comes out, the stories will be even better. So key thing to note there is if you're taking a kind of microservice approach to development, you sometimes get a lot of stuff for free, right? Doing virtually nothing, we can get an upgrade to this app, a big upgrade to the quality of the stories, and a big back-end upgrade to the complexity of the app just by kind of waiting. And if you choose well your core, your kind of the things you base microservices on, you can get that a lot. Okay, so I hope that explains the kind of server side of things and the overall anatomy of an integration in general. I hope people can understand there's integration in general, and then just how bzBond is kind of supporting those integrations. If you're not interested in bzBond, hopefully there are still some principles you can take from the kind of microservice architecture and the separation of some of the tasks of an integration. Okay, so there's a minute and a half left. I'm going to very quickly try and just show a basic thing, just so it's down there, because I know people are interested in it in general, and that is JavaScript on the server. So just to prove it can happen, here is, you need a root. This is a default root for bzBond server called function, so you don't actually need it. You can define a function, you can define parameters in an array. Those parameters can also include functions. Maybe we can talk about that later. Run the request, and you can get the result. That's running on the server. Obviously, it's not super clear that it is, but I promise it is. And yeah, that is basically another way to leverage bzBond server. It can just run JavaScript, give you a result, and that's hard to do on the server, on server side. You can't really do it that easily natively without plugins or some other external service. So kind of just as a positive extra function, we've included the ability to run server-side JavaScript, and you can run functions or you can run code. So yeah, that's one of the just tidbit. You can also run JavaScript just in a web viewer using bzBond on the client, and the reason to do that is it's just a bit more convenient than rolling your own web viewer kind of integration. If you're using bzBond anyway, you may as well leverage it that way. Details of that and more details of this are in the documentation for bzBond on the repo. Okay, so that's a good place to stop. I wasn't sure of the timing, but I think, allowing the last half hour to be breakout rooms and Q&A is great. So I don't want to go any further. I have a few other little things I can talk about, but yeah, that's the core. And I feel like that's more than enough info for people to digest. So thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, happy to take questions or just break it out, whatever you fancy.
Yeah, let's do, if anybody has any questions, why don't we do a few minutes of Q&A anyway.
For the bzBond server, are you using the backend's node?
Yes, that's a good, thank you for that question. I should have at least mentioned that. So essentially, yes, bzBond server is a node microservice. Now, it's designed to work with the default installs of Node and NPM on a FileMaker server. In some rare cases, it does help to have a separate Nodes installation, but certainly for the core, if you can run a single command that is in the run a single command from the README, and it will install the microservice. And it won't install anything else, right? It'll just install a small application, which is the microservice. So yeah, even though it is, it's a dependency for sure, it reduces portability of your server, but we've made it pretty lightweight. I will quickly also mention security. It's secure by default. It installs on a port that is not going to be open unless you want to open it. And it behaves pretty much the same as That's the built-in FileMaker server node apps. It's just kind of an internal service. You can't call it from outside the server, which is why it only works using perform script on server, because it would bounce if anyone from the outside tried to hit it. That's important for security, and it's important for performance, right? You don't want just anyone doing something really expensive on your server.
Okay.
Makes sense. Anybody else have any questions they want to contribute?